Well, again, everyone, are you ready for another episode of Jefferson's Salute to the Presidents? Today, you'll be taken from Kinderhook to the White House and back again as we salute the life of our eighth president, Martin Van Buren. Van Buren didn't like desserts, but he did love the savory delicacy of hog's head. So if you're okay with that, grab a pig's head, sit back, and enjoy the show. Martin Van Buren was born on December 5th, 1782, in a house attached to his father's tavern, which was once located on the grounds behind me. Van Buren was the first president not born a British subject and not born of British ancestry. He was Dutch. Milton spent his entire childhood here and was raised to speak Dutch, although he did learn English while attending school. Van Buren was the only president whose first language was not English. After learning law in New York City, Van Buren returned to Kinderhook in 1803 after he was admitted to the New York bar. Hannah Hose was 23 when she married 24-year-old Martin Van Buren on February 21st, 1807 in Catskill, New York. Martin Van Buren was elected to the New York State Senate in 1812 and served until 1820. Van Buren also served as New York's governor, but for only 2 months before he was appointed Secretary of State by President Andrew Jackson. I'm standing in front of the current New York Capitol building, which was built in the mid-1860s. The old state Capitol building, where Van Buren served, stood on the grounds directly behind me until it was demolished in 1883. Van Buren came to Washington, where he served as a United States Senator representing New York from 1821 until 1828. MVB moved up the political ladder when President Andrew Jackson appointed him as Secretary of State, then Ambassador to Great Britain. Then, in the 1832 presidential election, Jackson added Van Buren onto the ticket as vice president for his second term in office. This three-story brick house is known as the Decatur House and is located a short distance from the White House. The place was built in 1818 and is one of the oldest surviving structures in D.C. Van Buren lived in this rented house during his time serving as President Jackson's Secretary of State from March 28, 1829 to May 23, 1831. I'm standing in the old Senate chamber inside the United States Capitol. This chamber was used by the Senate from 1810 to 1859. The curved desk and mahogany chair used by the Vice President is in the background. Future Presidents Van Buren, Tyler, and Fillmore all used that chair during their terms as Vice President. Martin Van Buren received 170 electoral votes in the 1836 presidential election, which was better than the next closest candidate, William Henry Harrison, who had 73. On March 4, 1837, Van Buren stood on the east portico of the United States Capitol, where he recited the presidential oath of office. Outgoing President Andrew Jackson rode in a carriage to the Capitol with Van Buren before the inauguration, which marked the first time in history this was done. Once President Van Buren settled into the executive mansion, he continued down the same path set forth by his predecessor, Andrew Jackson. Van Buren kept most of Jackson's cabinet members and continued to support the seventh president's policies, including the Indian Removal Act signed in 1830. Tennessee Congressman Davy Crockett once said of the president, Van Buren is as opposite to General Jackson as dung is to a diamond. During his single term in office, President Van Buren opposed the annexation of Texas because it threatened to widen the slavery issue in our nation. But in 1839, Van Buren helped peacefully settle the border debate between Maine and New Brunswick, Canada, in what was known as the Aroostook War. Acting First Lady, Angelica Singleton Van Buren. Thanks to the Panic of 1837, which began just 2 months into Van Buren's presidency and sent the country into a recession, his bid for re-election in 1840 was a disaster. Whig candidate William Henry Harrison soundly defeated Van Buren 234 electoral votes to 60, in part to Harrison's campaign slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Because of the personal attacks during the campaign, including calling him Martin Van Buren, MVB did not attend Harrison's inauguration. When he left the executive mansion for good on March 4, 1841, Martin Van Buren returned to Kinderhook, where he spent his retirement at his Lindenwold estate. Van Buren became the third president who saw no states admitted to the Union during his administration. This home behind me, called Lindenwold, was built 1 mile south of downtown Kinderhook in 1797. President Van Buren purchased the home and 125 acres of land for $14,000 in 1839 while still in office. Following a single term as president, Van Buren resided in his new home where he conducted two more unsuccessful presidential bids for re-election, first in 1844 as a Democrat and then in 1848 as a Free Soil Party candidate. MVB named the estate Lindenwold, which was German for Linden Forest. The Albany to New York Post Road in front of the home was lined with American linden trees. I've made 3 visits to Lindenwold, but I couldn't tour the interior in 2020 due to the COVID pandemic. I'm going to knock on the front door and we'll go inside to visit the world of Martin Van Buren. This was the main hall, or entrance hall, inside Lindenwold. A large gathering of guests would have dined in this area. I laughed to myself when I heard the wallpaper on the wall to my left was original to the home and was selected by Martin Van Buren himself. The green room served several purposes in Lindenwold. When guests arrived to discuss politics with Van Buren, the women went to the green room to socialize. This room was also used by the Van Buren family as a place where they played games or listened to music. The president loved to play with his grandchildren in this room. The portrait above the fireplace was John Van Buren, Martin and Hannah's second son. After his presidency, Martin Van Buren was never far removed from the politics of the day. I'm standing in the formal parlor at Lindenwold where Van Buren's political guests would gather to smoke cigars, discuss politics, and talk about the women across the hall. The president's portrait hung above the fireplace, while portraits of Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson, whom Van Buren admired, adorned the adjacent wall of the parlor. I'm standing in the library at Van Buren's beloved Lindenwold, with a bust of the president situated along the far wall. Following dinner, guests were invited into the library to discuss the ongoing slavery issues and the likely potential for civil war. I'm standing on the edge of Martin Van Buren's bathtub, which was located on the second floor of the home. I gagged slightly when I envisioned the wild-haired president taking a bath beside me, although I suppose it was better than watching William Howard Taft in the tub. Talk about gagging. That's exactly what I did when I thought of Martin Van Buren seated on his toilet as he read the morning newspaper. This was Martin Van Buren's bedroom, which was situated on the second floor at the sunny southeast corner of the house. When Hannah Van Buren died on February 5th, 1819, Martin vowed never to remarry. He spent the final 43 years of his life in widowhood. This was Van Buren's shaving stand and razor that were situated in his bedroom. When I envisioned the president's wild side whiskers and unkempt appearance, I wondered what went through Martin's mind when he gazed into that mirror. Next to me is Van Buren's bedroom desk, which I never got to stand on because our National Park Service tour guide never let me out of a watchful eye. Martin Van Buren passed away in this bed at 2 a.m. on Thursday, July 24th, 1862 from bronchial asthma and heart failure. MVB was 79 years old. Surrounded by his sons John, Abraham II, and Smith Thompson Van Buren, the president's last words were, "There is but one reliance." As I stood alongside the bed, it dawned on me that the president had died shortly after the turmoil of the Civil War had begun. It was unfortunate and sad knowing President Van Buren passed away not knowing whether the nation he helped build would continue to exist. After lying in state at Lindenwold following his death, Van Buren's funeral was conducted at the Dutch Reformed Church in Kinderhook on July 28, 1862. Unfortunately, that original church was damaged by fire in 1867 and replaced by the church behind me 2 years later. Although this Dutch Reformed church was not the one where Van Buren's funeral was conducted, it was built in the footprint of the original church. Following the president's funeral service, 80 carriages under escort of the Kinderhook Fire Department slowly made its way to the village cemetery. On July 28, 1862, President Martin Van Buren's rosewood coffin was placed in a protective wooden container and lowered into the ground in the family plot at the Dutch Reformed Church Cemetery. Hannah Van Buren, who died on February 5th, 1819, was originally buried in Albany, but was reinterred alongside her husband after his death. I'm standing on the footstone at Martin Van Buren's grave, which was still wet from a rainstorm that nearly drenched me during my first visit in 2017. President Van Buren's coffin was made of rosewood, oval topped with silver trimming. A silver plate on the lid was etched with the words, Martin Van Buren died July 24th, 1862, aged 79 years, 7 months, 19 days. Although Van Buren's grave marker is one of the least impressive of all the presidents, it was still an honor for me to stand on it in silent tribute to the man known as Old Kinderhook. Did you enjoy the wild mutton chops Van Buren liked to sport? It's hard to believe, but he actually thought he looked handsome with his out-of-control whiskers and uncombed hair. I figured I needed a new hairdo myself. Please subscribe to our show and hit the like button, even if you didn't enjoy the Hog's Head. Our next episode will feature the life and short presidency of William Henry Harrison, our 9th president. Thank you for watching, and I'll shave before our next show. See you soon.